After talking to 911, Patsy called the Fernie's house and screamed at them to come over. Then she hung up, and then she called the Fleet and Priscilla White's house. John Ramsey had laid out the 3-page ransom note on the floor in a lit room right next to the phone. And he was reading the ransom note as Patsy was talking to 911, to the Fernies, and to the Whites. And then he quickly moved up the stairs, got dressed, came down the stairs, and met the policeman. Police officer Rick French arrived at the Ramsey household at 5:59, and Patsy let him in. And then John asked him some questions. And then Rick French, he moved around the house and looked for entryways into the house, including going into the basement. At this point, multiple people show up at the house. First, Fleet Priscilla White arrive around 5 minutes after 6. Then Officer Carl Veach arrives around the same time, and John Fernie arrives around this time. John Fernie parks in the back alley behind the house, looks through the glass door, and can see the ransom note laid out on the floor, and he reads a little bit of it. Then he comes around to the front and enters the house. Shortly thereafter entering the Ramsey house, Fleet White looked in the basement. He stated that the lights were on and the door leading into the boiler room was open. He said that he had opened the wine cellar door, the room was dark, he could not find the light switch, and he closed the door. Then he went to the train room and noticed the broken window, the suitcase underneath the window, and a piece of broken glass. Here's a timeline of what happens from there on. At 6:45, John Ramsey called his pilot and left a message. At the same time, some Boulder policemen arrived at the house. At 7:13, Reverend Overstock arrived. At 7:15, Burke is gotten out of bed and dressed, and he leaves with Fleet White and John Fernie to stay at the White's home. At 7:30, John Ramsey arranged for the $118,000 in cash. John searched the basement alone sometime before or around 8 a.m. He testified that he had gone down there that morning, and yet he could not provide a good time. At 8:10, Detective Arndt and Detective Patterson arrived at the house. At 8:30, the police have the telephone lines tapped. At the same time, Detective Arndt instructed John Ramsey on how to handle the phone call from the ransomer. At 9:20, Lafayette State Bank had collected enough cash for the ransom. John Fernie returned after arranging to have $118,000 in cash. My understanding is he did not bring the money because the police took it and were photocopying it and different bills. And John Ramsey was disappointed that John Fernie returned without the money. 10 o'clock, no ransomer called between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. More detectives showed and left. 10:30, Jonbenet's room was sealed off with police tape. At the same time, all the police officers and the 2 victim advocates left. At 10:40 through 10:45, sometime in that range, John Ramsey left his house to pick up his mail. I don't know if this is true and or where his mail would be. At about noon, the mood in the house was quiet and tense. John Ramsey milled around anxiously in the living room, and Patsy sat still in a chair. At 12:30, Detective Arndt noticed John was by himself. Also, she called the Boulder Police Department. At 1 o'clock, Detective Arndt suggested that John and Fleet should check the house from top to bottom. John went downstairs to the basement, with Fleet following him. They went to the train room and examined the broken window and looked for glass on the floor. They looked around in a few other places. Then they went to the boiler room and the wine cellar door. John Ramsey. Right. I remember grabbing the handle because the door was latched, because I expected it not to be latched. I reached out, flipped the latch, and opened the door, and immediately looked down. Lou. And you say immediately? John Ramsey. There was a white blanket, and I just knew that I had found her. Lou. How were you standing in the doorway when you observed that? John. I was probably right there. The door pulled open. The handle was on the left side of the door, and it opened this way, as I recall. Lou. So now I just want to get that right, because when you open the door, you could look inside the room. Is the light on or off at the time you opened the door? John. I think it was off. I don't remember it being on. It was off. Lou. Would you be able to see into that room if the light was off? John. I saw clearly, instantly. Yeah. Lou. Do you remember turning the light on? John. I don't think that I did. Well, this ends this episode, and I will follow this episode up with a review of this episode next.